Hey everyone, it's Jim
And Charles.
from Valves and More, an online vintage tube store. And today in Tube Lab number 248, we're going to try and answer the question, is speaker burn real?
Well, burn in. You can burn your speakers, although I don't know what that would get you.
Well, maybe some smoke, some popped woofers. In fact, actually, I remember years ago I was doing a little volunteer job, though we were paid a little bit of money, in a old historic theater that was mostly doing movies, but we did live shows as well. And one of the young lads liked to hang out in the theater and play his music really loud. And we had quite a good modern sound system with a lot of crown amps driving it. So you can guess what happened. He blew out the cones of every single woofer in the system.
Oh.
I think there was like 10 or 12 that had to be reconed. And my boss was a real nice guy. And he said, don't do that again. And then he just proceeded to order reconing kits, and he reconed every single one of them without ever once complaining. So
Wow.
that's the definition of a nice guy. Anyway, and he didn't fire the lad. So, anyways, can you imagine how loud he got it, because that system could go loud safely. So yeah. Anyways. But first, caution everyone, electronics and tube amplifiers can have very high voltages present, which can be lethal. Exercise extreme caution when working around them. Always consult a professional technician when in doubt. Okay, I hate clickbait, so I'll give you the answer up front. Yes, probably, sometimes, maybe, depends, possibly.
This is sounding an awful lot like the last episode.
Well, I just want to be upfront and honest. So, last week we talked about tube burn-in. And to recap, tubes need to be burned in, yes. But that should have been done at the factory or in later stages of testing. So sometimes a tube will benefit from a burn-in of 2 minutes to 2 hours.
Especially if they've been sitting for a very long time.
Yep. And in particular, power tubes for some reason. But in most cases, the tube will start to perform at its best a couple of minutes after you plug it in and turn it on. That's been our experience, and we handle thousands of tubes every year, new old stock and used. In fact, I was going to say good used, but when we bring in a large lot of used tubes, we throw out anywhere from 40% to 90%.
Yeah, well, that percentage is going up as we go along here. And we get in a lot of tubes all the way back to the 1920s up to maybe the late 80s these days.
Yeah.
So a huge range of them.
Now, we also talked a wee bit about how it takes time to learn a new critical sound, much longer than the actual initial hearing of it. Experienced critical listeners are well aware of this and can basically short-circuit this process and get a quick snapshot of the new sound. Now, both Charles and I do a lot of listening, both to tubes and to equipment, mostly our own designs. In fact, it's about a third of the design process of a new kit amp is
just listening to it.
Listening to it and then tweaking it, or going back and reevaluating the whole thing. In fact, last week we had the first prototype of what we hope will be a new monoblock. It's a solid state design. It's based on an historic circuit, and I basically built my own version of it.
And while it did sound good, it did have a flaw.
Well, before we get to the flaws, we always want to talk about the good stuff.
Oh, yeah.
The bass was phenomenal.
Yeah, bass was fantastic.
Mid-range was just okay.
It was okay.
It was okay. The treble?
I
mean, the treble was extremely detailed. But
to the point of being very harsh.
Yeah, it had... I wouldn't say it was badly amplified. It was just kind of edgy.
Yeah, and hard to listen to.
Now, we're used to listening to some of the best Class A tube monoblocks, I would argue, in the world. And as a result, we've been kind of spoiled. So
Yeah.
that's our reference.
Yeah, but we have to be able to meet that, or at least get very close to it in order for us to even consider releasing something.
Okay, now what about other audio equipment? Does burn-in make a difference? 3 question marks. How about speakers? Well, of all the audio components that could possibly benefit from burn-in, I'm pretty sure speakers are tops. Number 1. Now, presumably speaker driver manufacturers at least test a freshly assembled speaker before shipping it. And again, speaker box manufacturers must test the completed speaker as well as spot check fresh shipments of drivers. But is that enough? And do the speaker data sheets talk about this? Let's have a look at both. Okay, let's start with the data sheets. So this is a really nice Visiton paper-coned woofer. It's got a treatment on the cone, and it's got a really nice suspension. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And this was basically designed as a modern replacement for many vintage woofers that are now kaput. So what about the data sheet? So if we get the data sheet out and we look through it, you think that they would talk a little bit about break-in, yeah, or burn-in. There's nothing. So I thought, well, I'm going to go and look at a whole bunch of data sheets. And do any of them talk about this? Nada. Not a thing. Not a peep. Now, there's probably some boutique speaker manufacturers out there, you know, they're selling drivers for a couple grand a pop, who probably talk about this. But none of the drivers I own or have ever owned have ever been worth anything close to $2,000. And so I think what we should do is just look at the physical properties of the speaker and see if in fact it makes sense that this would benefit from a bit of burn-in. So what is a speaker? Well, it is, you ready for this? It's a pistonic electromagnetic motor that's designed to take a sine wave and transform it into basically mechanical motion. So
A sound pressure wave.
a sound pressure wave. So this cone basically disturbs the molecules in front of it, and they disturb the molecules in front of them, and they disturb the molecules in front of them, and eventually the sound gets to you. And in fact, way back, and I think the early to mid 18th century, somebody actually figured out how fast sound moves through air. So it was one of the first things we did in grade 9 science class. And of course, I've forgotten all that. But anyways, so it's even though it's a relatively simple device, getting high quality audio to our ears is not so simple. So let's look at the components. So back here we have a big magnet. The bigger the speaker, the higher the power, the bigger the magnet. And inside of this assembly here, we have a coil of wire. Here we have the actual diaphragm that will move the air, but it has to be suspended. So here is this is a nice modern suspension. A lot of vintage speakers use suspension materials that were foam. They were cheap to manufacture. They didn't last. They probably knew that was garbage. Before they went with that foam back in the 60s and 70s, they actually used accordion paper suspensions, and those are brilliant. In fact, our 15-inch bass drivers, our woofers, have an accordion suspension, and it's just wonderful, especially for bigger speakers. What about the back of the speaker? Well, you can just see that we've got a suspension back here. It's really tough to get the light to there it sort of is. And that's called the spider. And what that does is it helps align the driver inside this whole assembly, inside the cage. And it also provides some dampening in the rear. So there's dampening here, there's dampening back here, there's dampening from the design of this motor assembly here as well. And of course there's dampening in the power amp, but it's not part of the speaker, so let's not talk so much about that. And this, depending on what type of driver this is, this can be very stiff. I mean, I'm pushing fairly firmly, and look at how stiff this speaker is. So something large like this with a big suspension, you can well imagine that 40 hours of playtime after you've installed this into your speaker is going to change the sound at least a tiny little bit.
Especially whenever you're dealing with flexible, movable materials that are like this, that are moving an awful lot over time. Their properties are going to shift. They're going to break in a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, components like the spider back here, or some people I think call it the accordion because it sort of looks like the bellows of an accordion. I wish I could get a light in there. It's almost impossible.
Yeah, let's grab a light. We'll be right back.
Okay, Charles has actually got a spotlight pointed right through that gap, and now you can see the spider more clearly. And it's really not nearly as stiff as this outer surround. So it probably will break in a little bit over time, but I have a feeling that really the biggest break-in is going to be whatever the cone material is, if it needs to adjust a little bit with time. But the predominant change is going to happen, I think, on the suspension. Now, I would hope that good speaker manufacturers actually burn in their speakers and then do their testing. That would make the most sense. So hopefully, when you're looking at this speaker's data sheet and you're looking at the frequency response and the other specifications for it, hopefully this is after the speaker is basically burned in and is operating at its normal conditions. So I would expect that it would take a while for a brand new speaker system to adjust. But I have a feeling it depends on how big the drivers are. So let's just change out the driver selection and take a look at something smaller. Okay, now that woofer we were looking at was an 8-inch woofer. What about a 5.5-inch woofer? Well, if you look at it, this driver is probably not moving nearly as much as the bigger one. It's not designed to handle nearly as much power. It's got a very similar suspension, so it's a nice quality suspension, and it's got, I think, a synthetic cone. So I think this is probably going to be, and of course you can see the spider in here. I think Charles has still got his floodlight. Let's see if we can bring it in there. There you go. So even though this probably benefits from a bit of burn-in, I suspect that a smaller woofer like this will change very little over time compared to a larger one. But that is just a supposition. In fact, the comment section last week when we talked about tube burn-in was a fire, but with good comments. In fact, I'd like to commend all of our viewers because we've heard nothing but really good constructive comments. It's very rare that I have to ask someone to go somewhere else. But when I do, I give them usually one warning, and we've got some very good comments from those people subsequently who understand that the site is a site for people who are friends. We're online friends, we're audio enthusiasts.
And we love to share great information, and obviously we don't know everything. So if somebody has something to contribute, then pop it down in the comments. We'd love to hear about it.
Just present it in a kindly, reasonable, fair fashion, and make sure to provide supporting evidence for whatever that you're discussing. Okay. Well, here's a really small, it's about a 3/4 inch tweeter. It's a soft dome tweeter. It's got a suspension all the way around here where that dome connects up to the actual assembly. And of course, it's got a magnet on the back. It actually has quite a good size magnet for the size of tweeter. In fact, this is a really nice little VIFA that was used in all kinds of speakers for years and years and years. And would this benefit from burn-in? Well, if most of burn-in is really about breaking in the suspension, I would say no. It probably will sound as good in the first hour as it will in the 100th hour. And in fact, I've owned these tweeters and versions of this tweeter for years and years, and they all basically sound the same. They do a really great job of the high frequencies, but because they're small, their dispersion is small, right? What about a little bigger soft dome? And this dome has got a few little dings and dents, but it'll work just fine. It's got a much, much, much bigger magnet structure. It can handle a lot more power. And in fact, I don't have the label on it. Oh, there it is. It's an MDT. And these are great. And again, this is a relatively small speaker driver. And I can't imagine that with good material sciences and a good build that we would see the sound shift very much over time. So I would be less concerned about tweeters and more concerned about breaking in those larger drivers.
Mm-hmm. And the material in the larger drivers probably shifts maybe about the same amount as this, but there's much more on the larger drivers to make that shift.
Now, how would you break in a speaker? Well, you could just plug in some music and sit down and enjoy. But if you're really kind of anxious to get the whole system broken in so that you can really listen to those speakers, I would suggest you could simply play some white noise. And you could play some white noise at a normal listening volume for perhaps 24 hours. And you could drop in every once in a while and listen to them and see if you can hear a difference. I suspect that a well-designed, well-built speaker system will probably sound very good out of the box in the first minute of play.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be interesting to have a friend drop over and listen to that first minute and then not bring them back until perhaps a month later and let them listen again and see what they think. So it's tough to hold a memory of audio, but key elements often help in critical listening. So in fact, we actually have in the store under information, there is actually a sheet in which you can assess sound. And it's got a list of test tracks that we've used in the past. So keeping a little note, a note sheet of your listening experience can really help you sort of reference back. And the way it's done is we just break down the categories. In fact, why don't we grab the sheet and we'll be right back. Okay, now this is an old tube rolling sheet that I used quite a bit years ago when we were first introducing new tubes, and we still use this sheet occasionally when we have a brand new tube that we've never talked about before. And you could certainly use this to give you sort of a basic note sheet for listening to speakers or listening to preamps or whatever. And the way we do this is we choose some tracks that we're familiar with, that have good detail, that are well recorded, and have various parts of the audio spectrum. So I like to break things down from the bass to the mid-range to the treble. I love to make little notes as to if they're good or very good or weak, why. So that's really important. And then you could expand this, of course, to talk about, especially with speakers, how detailed they are.
What the sound stage is like.
Yep. And so on and so on. There's just so much stuff that you could make up your own custom sheet for analyzing speakers, and there's probably something online that somebody has made up as well.
It's just a good idea to mark things down if you have to come back to something after some time. Especially we're doing all sorts of projects here constantly, and we try to focus on one or two things, because if we let it sit for too long, it's hard to remember what we were doing when we come back to it.
Yeah, so if you do a note sheet, let's say on a brand new speaker, or you go over to a friend's place and he's got a brand new speaker, or she has a brand new speaker, I should say they, then go ahead and right from the beginning start off by making some listening notes. Make them as readable and detailed as you can without being ridiculous. So instead of a paragraph of comments about the bass, try and do it in like 4, 5, 6 words. Something very concise and short and sweet. And then park it. And then when you come back and do a second listening of your own system or someone else's, don't look at the sheet. Pull out a new sheet and do a new listening, same tracks, same sequence.
And then compare them.
And see if, in fact, things have shifted a little bit. But don't change anything. Try and get the volume the same speaker position, same room, same music. Volume is really important because the human brain perceives more volume in audio as being better.
And it can affect the amount of detail that you actually hear in a track as well.
Yeah, so you always want to come in at a normal listening level. I'm always surprised when I audition equipment. I can remember the gentleman who showed me our current speakers that are in system right now, and these are the dual concentrics. And I was listening to them at a normal listening volume, and he thought I would prefer to have them louder. So we listened to some loud music. I didn't have the heart to tell him I really couldn't hear anything anymore. It was just loud. So loud's not good for critical listening. Not unless you're doing a PA system for, a revival band for some rock heroes from the 60s and 70s. Okay, well, hopefully that helped out. I'm sure there'll be lots of comments. Just, take your time, write concisely, and be polite.
Yeah, and this is obviously not an exhaustive list of equipment that needs burning. There's going to be more coming later, so be patient.
Okay, well, Charles, you've actually got some really interesting tubes to show off.
Yeah, so I'm going to go grab those, and we'll be right back.
Well, I think it was yesterday or the day before, somebody sent us a list of really rare and well-respected 6SN7s that he would like to know if we have any. And I had to tell him that all the tubes he was looking for are basically extinct as 6SN7s.
Yeah, so you can still find singles or maybe a bad testing pair out there, but they're just not that common anymore.
Yeah, and what's left is the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the barrel. In fact, we're going to continue to warn people, caution everyone, there are a lot of unscrupulous sellers now out there, and they are selling junk, and they are devious. They will actually manufacture what looks like an original vintage box. Somewhere deep in the description, they might make in small print a little note saying that the boxes are remanufactured, and they will actually clean the tubes to the point and even wax the bases to the point that they look brand new.
Yeah. But then when you test them, wah wah.
Yeah. So, anyways, so Charles thought, well, actually, even though many of these tubes are extinct as 6SN7s, we've got
12 SN7 versions of them. And the gentleman that was looking for tubes in particular was looking for this vintage ken-rad type. This is a very early ken-rad 6SN7. It's the black glass version with this really interesting kind of bottom flashing that goes into the black glass. Tungsol did this too with some of their early tubes. And I think RCA as well for a very short time.
Now they are GTs.
They are GTs, so you can't run them in just about anything, even if it does take 12 volts. There are a few amps out there that will take a 12 volt version of the 6SN7.
Including our own universal 6 or 12 SN7 kit preamp. In fact, there's a new version of that kit that is in the lineup.
Yeah, I would call it around the corner, not too far. A lot of the development work's actually already done on it. But
in fact, you probably can hear a little bit of some of my favorite modern world jazz in the background. And we were looking after our neighbor's dog, Willow, she's just a delightful creature. But they're moving today, and Will was getting a little stressed. So I thought, well, let's close the windows and put some really smooth Anwar on.
And she laid down and relaxed and just listened to it and enjoyed.
Yeah, and I did too. So it's lucky that I actually got back to this.
Yeah, so I checked what we had in stock for 12-volt tubes for this type, and we actually have a decent number of them, and they weren't even in the store. In fact, they aren't even right now. I have to get them up as soon as this video is done. And so I popped them onto my my tester. I tested up a small number of them, and I put them onto my noise tester and had a listen. And wow, do these ever sound good?
You've got the label there. Let's just roll it around and see how they're testing. Well, that's actually a completely balanced twin triode.
Yep.
And the ken-rad, the early ken-rad 6SN7 smoke glass, of course, has got a huge following. And as we mentioned earlier, they are extinct tubes now.
Yeah. And
so imagine, we still have new old stock, new in the box. In fact, you've got a really interesting box.
Yeah.
And the word on top there, the company that handled these tubes, says it all.
Sperry Gyroscope Company. They made high-end military equipment, particularly a lot for the Second World War and afterwards. And
they specialized in bombing sites, but they did, I think, aerial photography and
navigation systems, all sorts of things. And they needed the best tubes they could possibly get to run those systems. They were vital electronic components, and so they ordered from the best. And that included Tungsol, Sylvania, and ken-rad for a lot of their tubes.
Yeah, you'll never see a Sperry box or a relabeled tube with Sperry on it that it was a junk tube. They're always good tubes. Mm-hmm. So talking about good tubes, you've got
another Sperry box, except this one is also marked as being Tungsol. And this is another tube that is basically extinct in the 6SN7 version. And that's the mouse ear, the famous 12SN7 GT mouse ear by Tungsol.
Yeah, it's not only is it a tall boy, but it's a very distinctive tall boy.
And these are really hard to find with good testing numbers. Even, I'd say probably 5 years ago, we were finding 6SN7 GT mouse ears, and they were new old stock, new in box, and they were way out. Obviously, they were the last of what was left of the new old stock that was out there, and these are still testing beautifully.
And what have you got up last? And before we go, we'll actually talk a little bit about the sonics of these tubes.
Yeah, so here we've got a Rogers, and this is the Rogers 12SN7, and Rogers, of course, as we've talked about before, imported parts from Sylvania in the US and finished construction of the tube at their Toronto plant.
And there almost certainly was a long-running business relationship. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Sylvania got purchased out in probably about 1980 or 81, got purchased by Philips.
And Rogers had been purchased as well, I think just a little bit earlier than that.
Yeah.
And so this is a 12SN7 GT Mark tube, but this is actually almost certainly a GTA because we see this branded as both GT and GTA, and it's consistent with the second version GTA Sylvania builds, and they sound just like a Sylvania GTA would. They're great tubes.
And what's the distinction between all these tubes? They all have sort of a unique sound profile.
Yeah. Okay, so this one sounds a lot like a Sylvania house sound, sort of a mid to late version of that. They have a warm, rich, harmonic-filled sound, particularly good for vocals and sort of a mid-range on them.
Excellent detail.
Excellent detail.
Reasonably low noise.
Yep. The Tungsols are known for having excellent detail across the whole range, but not a whole lot of warmth across it. So this is for very critical, detail-oriented listening for the most part.
In fact, the detail is so impressive that if you're running a pure Class A system that has got really high definition, the level of detail into a recording is phenomenal. If you have a very good recording, it's almost like you can hear all the way back into the studio, back through the mics, through the mixing board, through the mics, right into the actual room. And in fact, if somebody does something that they really shouldn't have been doing, tapping their feet or, moving around their lips a little bit too close to the microphone, you'll hear it with a tube like this. So, so there's a lot of good about this, particularly for audiophiles. For audiophiles, it's the equivalent of a wet dream. But if the recording is not well made, of course,
you hear everything.
You hear everything.
Yeah. And lastly, we've got the ken-rad. So I listened to this, and it actually really surprised me because it had a very deep, warm, extended bass on it, and a very nice mid-range as well. I'd say it was almost comparable to the Sylvania Rogers over here, very close to it. But the bass on this, the low end, when that's something that we see on a lot of vintage tubes in these older types, they tend to have a better low end performance.
Yeah. Now, bass tubes really don't affect bass significantly compared to other factors in your system. So the recording, if the bass wasn't recorded well originally, it doesn't matter what remastered version you've got of a favorite recording, it's still not going to be there, and you can't put it back in. Speakers are huge for bass, and the elephant in the room is the room.
Yep.
A room can swallow bass up or create these peaks in the room. So room treatment and speaker setup and choosing speakers are really critical. But if you get all of that reasonably well done, when you get a tube that's got a better bass presentation, or it amplifies the bass a little bit better than its compatriots,
you can actually hear that difference then at that point. And I do all my critical listening, at least for noise testing, through headphones. In the same system, in the same setup every time with the same test tracks. And so I can really hear the difference between each one of these tubes whenever I do that.
In fact, the headphone amplifier you use is version 1 of a prototype build we did, 3 years ago?
Yeah, it's been a little while. And it's a very good amplifier. It's just way too expensive to release.
Someday, if our kit business gets a little bit bigger, I think we'll probably end up manufacturing a transformer-coupled headphone amp.
Yeah, maybe a small run of them. We'll have to see. But it's fantastic. I mean, I use it every single day, and it's been reliable and great sounding the entire time.
Okay, well, thanks for digging those out, Charles. And if you stay to the very end, here's some discount codes to help you out. There is a secret code that's actually fairly easy to figure out. Lots of people grab it, so I'm not going to tell you because that wouldn't be any fun, would it? And we can reach almost everybody around the world with flat rate $20 shipping. And if your order is $150 or more after the discount, the shipping's on us, folks. Cheers. This is, I almost goofed that up. This is Jim.
And Charles.
Signing off. Cheers, everyone.